Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your co-host, Joanne.
And on today's episode, January 3rd, 2017, we talk to journalist Benjamin Norton about what's going on in the Yemen civil war. But before we do that, let's go around the empire. We start with United States European Command and President Obama's escalation of tensions with Russia by sending more military equipment into Eastern Europe. Pentagon Media, Stars and Stripes reports that U.S. soldiers offloaded scores of combat vehicles from ship to shore in Germany Sunday at the massive port there, pressing forward with one of the largest U.S. force movements in Europe since the end of the Cold War. Some 2,500 pieces of gear belonging to the 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division, including Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, are bound for NATO's eastern flank, making a 6,000-mile journey from Fort Carson, Colorado. Quote, "Let me be very clear, this is one part of our efforts to deter Russian aggression, ensure territorial integrity of our allies, and maintain a Europe that is whole, free, prosperous, and at peace," said Lieutenant General Tim Ray, a deputy commander of U.S. European Command, in remarks to reporters in Bremerhaven, Germany. This comes on the heels of tensions in Ukraine, which are apparently being worked through with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who is apparently trying to get some sort of new reset with the incoming Trump administration. At United States Northern Command, the home front, the Obama administration released an evidence-free, quote-unquote, intelligence report on Russia hacking the election. The report quickly became a laughingstock when it was discovered that much of it included a breakdown of Russia Today shows that had been off the air for over 2 years. Solid evidence has yet to be presented to show the hacking of DNC and John Podesta was the Russians, let alone that the Russians were the one who provided the information to WikiLeaks, let alone that WikiLeaks determined the outcome of the election or significantly influenced it. Now on to United States Pacific Command. From Reuters, China is suspected to be taking indirect action against South Korea's decision last year to deploy a U.S. anti-missile system. South Korea's finance minister said China worries that the U.S. Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, THAAD, system's powerful radar can penetrate its territory and has objected to the deployment. South Korea and the United States say the missile system is aimed solely at countering any threat from North Korea. It is due to be deployed this year. China is officially denying it, but we feel their actions are linked and that there may have been an indirect response taken, said Finance Minister Hu Il-ho told a news conference on Thursday. Sangjeong City. Quote, "It is hard to ask them what they're up to when they have been denying it officially," unquote. Hu did not elaborate on what he meant by indirect action, but China recently rejected applications by South Korea to add charter flights between the two countries for the carriers. China has also been flexing its muscle in the South China Sea, where it is struggling to gain ground against U.S. naval domination. On to United States Africa Command, Trump's policy on the African continent. Joseph Warangu told the BBC that though Trump's critics claim his apparent isolationism might result in less attention paid to Africa, that, quote, could just force Africans to find solutions from within by strengthening our institutions, improving infrastructure, governance, and security, and trading more amongst ourselves. Notably, Libya's Gaddafi had similar goals for more independence and a strong Pan-Africa. African Union Commission will appoint a new chairperson in January. In Darfur, Sudan, gunmen in military uniforms shot and killed 8 people, mostly women, in their homes and injured 60, in an area where sporadic clashes between the army and the rebels have continued. Libya continues to be a disaster. The UN-appointed government in Libya, the GNA, has largely failed to exert its authority over a country that slid into lawlessness after the 2011 uprising that toppled Muammar Gaddafi. To the United States Southern Command, from The Wire, the future U.S. role in Colombia on December 16th, President Barack Obama signed into law a bipartisan commission to assess 4 decades of U.S. counter-narcotics policies and programs in Latin America. The Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission Act, introduced by Democrat Eliot Engel and Republican Matt Salmon in Congress, represents a significant shift in American foreign policy towards its southern neighbors. American drug policy is already under indictment domestically. 8 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized marijuana in conflict with federal law. In the 2016 election, supporters of state-level initiatives to regulate cannabis in California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada argued that it would generate tax revenue, lowering policing costs, and undermine the black market. The new commission's comprehensive review will weigh those options, and others internationally will assess the success of U.S. drug policies in Latin America in reducing the supply and abuse of drugs and the damages associated with illicit drug markets. It will evaluate alternative policy models and make reform recommendations. We'll see if this causes any shift in the drug war in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America, with the U.S. as a significant military presence. And finally, to the United States Central Command, the Saudis and Qataris believe the U.S. would overthrow Assad for them, according to Patrick Coburn. Quote, getting the U.S. to overthrow Assad was the heart of the Syrian opposition's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar policy since 2011, when they believed they could orchestrate regime change in Damascus along the lines of what had just happened in Tripoli with the overthrow and killing of Muammar Gaddafi. But the Obama administration, quote, was very careful not to be dragged into a war in Syria to serve somebody else's agenda. Obama's critics claim that the U.S. is a fading power in the Middle East. Cockburn says that isn't true. He just wasn't willing to oppose Russian military in order to change the outcome in Syria. The Syrian ceasefire deal, negotiated between Russia, Turkey, Iran, the Syrian government, and some of the Syrian rebels, appears to be holding for now. Meanwhile, in Yemen, Alternet reports bombings by Saudi Arabia using U.S. weapons has led to famine that could kill millions. Since March 2015, the U.S. has supported a Saudi-led coalition that has bombed Yemen, the poorest country in the Middle East, with tens of billions of dollars worth of American and British weapons. More than 1,000 refueling sorties by U.S. planes and intelligence and guidance from the American and British militaries. Saudi Arabia has carried out thousands of airstrikes, at least one-third of which have struck civilian sites. The Western-backed Saudi-led coalition has also intentionally targeted food production and the agricultural sector in its bombing campaign in Yemen in what a leading expert described as a scorched earth strategy. The author of that article, Benjamin Norton, joins us next. And that was Around the Empire. Now we have our conversation with journalist Benjamin Norton, who works at Alternet on the GrayZone project, to talk about Yemen. Welcome to the show, Ben. So I think we should start with just an overview of the conflict, because this has not gotten a lot of coverage in the Western press. And so can you just go give us a brief overview for people who are listening? What is the Yemen civil war / Saudi intervention / U.S. intervention? Where is it? How did it start, and where are we now?
Great. Well, thanks. Saudi Arabia is leading a coalition of 10 Arab countries that also has the support of the U.S. and the U.K. and France to a lesser extent. The U.S. and the U.K. are not only providing large amounts of weapons, they're also providing military support, refueling sorties for planes, intelligence, military intelligence, etc. Saudi Arabia, the coalition that it's leading, is trying to restore former Yemeni leader Hadi, who is ostensibly an elected president. However, he ran in an election in which he was the only candidate. So his government is technically recognized as the so-called internationally recognized government, but I mean, it's not really internationally recognized, or rather, it's not really recognized as a democratic government. It's simply the government that existed before it was toppled by the Houthi movement, and this is what brings us to the war. The Houthis are a group that are mostly based in northern Yemen. They've been active for many years, and they actually previously had been enemies of the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is the former leader, who was essentially forced to step down in 2011 with Arab Spring protests. Well, the Houthis, grew over those years and organized, and eventually took over the capital, Sana'a. And this led Saudi Arabia, with the support of Western governments, to lead a bombing campaign in March 2015 to try to topple the Houthis, who have now created a government and are running Yemen, essentially. And since that time, the UN and human rights groups have documented extreme, crimes committed by the U.S.-backed coalition. including the bombing of dozens of hospitals and medical centers, the bombing of schools, civilian areas like homes. You can go down the list. Even a refugee camp, even an Oxfam humanitarian aid warehouse. They've been relentless. In fact, an analysis done several months ago found that 1/3 of all of the targets that the Saudi coalition has hit have been civilian targets. That could be a conservative estimate. Around 4,000 civilians have died. And that's especially given this has gotten very little coverage in the U.S. media and given the U.S. role in facilitating all of this. But it's not even just, as I mentioned earlier, the military deaths. Tens of thousands of people in Yemen have died from the humanitarian crisis. And the UN has called the humanitarian catastrophe that has been created by this conflict probably one of the worst in the world, if not the worst in the world. It's up there with Syria. And of course, we hear nonstop coverage of Syria because, U.S., as Chomsky and Herman famously articulated in Manufacturing Consent, U.S. media outlets so frequently echo the U.S. government party line. And in Syria, of course, we can demonize the big baddies of Russia and Iran and Assad. Whereas in Yemen, it's very clear that the U.S. is on the side that is brutally bombing civilian areas, killing thousands of civilians. The UN has reported multiple times that the Saudi-led U.S.-backed coalition is responsible for nearly 2/3 of civilian casualties. So, of course, this hasn't gotten too much coverage. And another factor is Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East. The U.S. has been carrying a secretive drone war in Yemen for many years. Jeremy Scahill discussed that drone war in his famous book, Dirty Wars, which is also addressed in the movie, and the killing of civilians in the drone program there. But the UN has estimated that every single 10 minutes, a child in Yemen dies from preventable disease. It's absolutely catastrophic. I mean, this is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. And further exacerbating that is the fact that not only has the U.S. supported the Saudi-led coalition, which has brutally bombed the poorest country in the Middle East for 21 months, in addition to that, the Saudi-led coalition has imposed a blockade on Yemen since last March, March 2015. And this blockade has prevented not just medical supplies, but also food from entering Yemen, which is a very food insecure country. Before the conflict even began, Yemen, which is incredibly impoverished, was importing 90% of its food and was absolutely reliant on foreign exports. And of course, medical supplies are not able to get in, along with oil and even humanitarian aid. And we can talk about this a little bit more if you'd like, but the U.S. Navy has played a role in enforcing that blockade on behalf of the Saudi-led coalition. So right from the very beginning and throughout this entire process, the U.S. has been inextricably involved. And I'll just, we can talk more about the details, but I'll end on this note here and mention that the New York Times editorial board published an article finally several months ago acknowledging the horrific war in Yemen. And the New York Times editorial board, to its credit, I mean, this is an editorial board in the past that spread lies about weapons of mass destruction and supported the invasion of Iraq. But to its credit, it actually did call for the U.S. to stop supporting the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And one of the things that the New York Times editorial board acknowledged is that if it were not for U.S. support, the Saudi-led coalition would probably immediately end the war overnight. Saudi Arabia simply cannot wage a war at this capacity on a large country. It simply does not have the military potential to do so. It does not have the experience. This really, it is, of course, technically on paper a Saudi-led war, but really at the end of the day, this is a war that has only continued for so long and has only killed so many people because it has the staunch support of the U.S. and Britain.
Right, and that's a great overview. So for people who are listening, I think you got a great overview there. And to a point, I've been following this a bit, and the Pentagon's justifications are kind of interesting for the U.S. involvement, because the U.S. is clearly involved in war crimes, facilitating war crimes, selling cluster munitions, which are banned in many countries, and the earlier defense. Now, it's important to remember in December, Obama actually had a symbolic stopping of armaments. He canceled a $350 million defense allotment for Raytheon. The Pentagon's position was interesting. They would say, well, we're helping with the Saudis because we're helping them target. If it wasn't for us, they would hit even more civilians because we're helping them target their weapons, and that's what we're adding on. Now, before you respond to that, which I think is clearly not true or a ridiculous justification, also talk about the fact that while, yes, Obama canceled this Raytheon contract, they are still doing in-flight fueling for these Saudi bombers, and they're still providing the targeting intelligence. So what is even the point of stopping an arms shipment if you're going to refuel the planes and give them a target list to hit with the munitions they still have from the previous arms deal?
Yeah, I mean, great points all around. First of all, I'll preface by saying that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. both downplayed the reports that the U.S. actually curtailed U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. In fact, Jubair, the Saudi foreign minister, and Kerry had a meeting that was quoted by Reuters in which they said that it wasn't really a cancellation of a U.S. arms deal. It was more a prolongation, and they accredited the long process of giving these weapons to Saudi Arabia, etc. So I mean, it was kind of a bureaucratic response. But I would invite listeners to look into that, and I just wanted to point out that I'm rather skeptical of the reports that claimed that the U.S. canceled this arms deal. I think it was more of a bureaucratic kind of a shift in what the policy was, but I don't think it really represents anything admirable. And if I can, I'll also add a little about the U.S. Congress, because especially now, but for years the U.S. Congress has been chock full of hawks who could care less about a country like Yemen. But in the past several months, there have been a few lawmakers who have tried to take action to block U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And for some background, the Obama administration has sold more weapons to countries throughout the world than any other president since World War II. And we're talking, estimates vary. Some estimates say 115 billion. I've seen estimates actually that say it could be even as high as 200 billion with the two administrations of Obama combined. But the U.S. has sold tens of billions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and not just the U.S., also the U.K. and even Canada. Canada has this new liberal government that everyone loves under Trudeau, but he himself has sold billions of arms sales or continued billions of arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
And Hillary Clinton said, just to jump in, Hillary Clinton said that was like they were celebrating in an email I saw from The Intercept was talking about that they had the largest gift. Yeah, the largest arms sale. I think this was related to airplanes. Can you talk? Is that part of this large record-setting arms sales? That one was that historic?
Yeah, there's a WikiLeaks email, or an email rather, that was released by WikiLeaks. Actually, I think it was probably released by the State Department, and then WikiLeaks published it, in which members of Hillary Clinton's State Department are kind of jokingly referring to an enormous arms sale to Saudi Arabia by the U.S. as like a kind of Christmas gift. And there are actually multiple emails acknowledging U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but one of the U.S. arms sales done to Saudi Arabia under the Obama administration was $60 billion. $60 billion. So we're talking about enormous sums of money, almost unprecedented. Again, unprecedented since World War II. We're talking that level of warfare. And of course, what is Saudi Arabia doing with these weapons? Well, of course, bombing Yemen and funding extremists in Saudi Arabia, arming them, and around the region. So of course, this is another long issue I don't really want to get into right now, but the Obama administration claims that it's had more of a hands-off policy in Syria, which is absurd because it's spent billions of dollars arming and training rebels, and they blame Saudi Arabia for participating in Syria. But where is Saudi Arabia getting these weapons? They're getting these weapons from the U.S. along with Qatar, etc. But back to the issue of U.S. lawmakers. So members of both the House and the Senate have actually taken action to try to block U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. In fact, there was a symbolic action taken. It wasn't super politically significant because it was for a $1.15 billion arms sale, which, again, out of this $115 billion is not that big, but it was important symbolically. And members of both the House and the Senate introduced legislation. In the House, it was led by Congressman Ted Lieu, who is from Los Angeles and is very progressive. in the Senate. There was bipartisan action. Also, Ted Yoho in the House, who's a Republican. So there was bipartisan action in an attempt to block U.S. arms sales. Neither of the bills passed, unfortunately. But I mean, it's important that members of both parties, including Democrats, were willing to go up against the Obama administration and say, why are we funding these war crimes? I've interviewed Ted Lieu multiple times. I've spoken to Representative Yoho's office, and both of them stressed that the U.S. is likely complicit in war crimes, and this is absurd. But to get back to your original question here, yeah, I mean, I think the Pentagon's argument has been absurd from the very beginning, and the State Department's argument has been absurd from the very beginning. Although I've heard from some sources that people within the State Department are very conflicted, even more so than they are about other conflicts. So, in the case of Syria, the State Department and the Pentagon are actually arming rebels that are fighting each other inside Syria.
Yeah.
Maybe not to that degree, but with the war in Yemen, there certainly is a lot of internal turmoil. People are asking why the U.S. is so intent on supporting this horrific war. They ask what the strategic importance is. And I think, looking at government statements and also just looking a little more cynically at what the government is saying, I think there are a few different reasons the U.S. is so invested in this war. One, the U.S. it's in some ways, I think, saving face and trying to prove to Saudi Arabia that it is committed to Saudi Arabia.
For not overthrowing Assad, right? For not overthrowing Assad.
Well, and also the Iran deal and the fact that the Obama administration has voiced some tepid criticisms of Saudi Arabia, not nearly what Saudi Arabia deserves to be criticized for, but there has been some tepid criticism. But I think that's a factor, but I don't think that's the primary factor. I think another factor is there's an impression, which I think is largely exaggerated, but it has a grain of truth, that this is a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's a proxy war inside Yemen. I think that's a very misleading argument because the war in Syria, I think, in some ways can be seen certainly as a proxy war. The war in Yemen, it's not like the war in Syria. In the war in Syria, you have Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the CIA, the UK, MI6, etc., all backing rebels. And then the other side, you have the Syrian government, Iran, and Russia. There are elements of certainly a proxy war aspect to that. Whereas in the war in Yemen, you have a coalition of 10 Arab countries backed by the US and the UK, bombing the poorest country in the Middle East and fighting Yemeni rebels who, if they have any support, they have a little support from Iran. This is not a proxy war. This is a war against Yemenis. This is a war to restore the Hadi government, the Hadi regime. Hadi himself fled to Saudi Arabia when the Houthis took over the capital in Sana'a. So Hadi is in many ways a puppet for Saudi Arabia, and of course Saudi Arabia is an extension of U.S. power in the Middle East. So I would not say the war in Yemen is a proxy war, but there are allegations, some of which are perhaps true, that Iran has provided support to the Houthi rebels. For many months, Saudi Arabia has been accusing the Houthis of being tools of Iran. That's certainly not tools. They don't take orders from Iran.
Right.
I think in some ways they might be like Hamas, where they get support from Iran, perhaps in the form of weapons. There are reports that claim that Iran is sending weapons to Oman, and Oman, even though it's a Gulf country and it's neighboring, on the south of the Arabian Peninsula, it's right next to Yemen. Oman is a Gulf country, but it also has, unlike the other Gulf countries, a history of somewhat cordial ties to Iran. So there are allegations that, and the U.S. government has claimed this, that Iran is sending weapons to Oman, and then Oman is allowing those weapons to go to the Houthis inside Yemen. Perhaps that's true, but at the end of the day, there's not a parity between the sides by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, these would be small arms, right? These would be small arms or maybe some This is not going to be the cluster bomb munitions that the Saudi Air Force.
Absolutely not.
I mean, nothing even close.
Houthis don't have an air force, so it's important to realize that. I mean, they're being brutally bombed by Saudi Arabia. So the U.S. is providing intelligence, and it is true the U.S. has been providing targeting information. And I actually think, although the argument is ridiculous, I think the Pentagon is actually right when it says that if it were not providing this intelligence to the Saudi Air Force, that the Saudi Air Force would be committing even worse atrocities. I think that's absolutely true. But that said, what the Pentagon doesn't mention is if the U.S. weren't providing support to the Saudi-led coalition, the war would end. So,
Right.
I mean, it's a kind of ridiculous response that I don't even think merits any kind of, serious consideration. But it is true. We now know we have, thanks to FOIA requests done by news outlets like Reuters, and I'll give Reuters some credit. I mean, Reuters has done some really good reporting on this war. We know that inside the State Department there has been this internal schism, and in fact, lawyers from the State Department have raised concerns internally to their superiors and said that under international law, the U.S. could be held accountable for war crimes. And Reuters obtained some fascinating emails in which they discuss meetings inside the State Department, inside the Pentagon, in which senior officials say that they want to brainstorm ways for the U.S. to be shielded from international law. So, I mean, there are so many layers of extreme hypocrisy. And I mean, I can go on for a long time, but I add one more point here. The allegation of Iran arming the Houthis, I think, should not, I just want to stress this point, should not make people think that this is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There's no parity whatsoever. It is true that the Houthis are Shia, but the thing is, it's not sectarian in that way. There are Sunnis inside Yemen who support the Houthis, and Yemen is a pretty diverse country in terms of sects. It has a majority Sunni population, but it also has a very significant, about 40% Shia population. And if you look, I mean, there have been reports on massive protests inside the capital, Sana'a, of people supporting the Houthi government. This doesn't mean that they necessarily are fans of the Houthis, right? I mean, I think in some ways it's like Hamas. Hamas is not a very popular party inside Gaza, but if you look at, and there are right-wing, in some ways repressive government, there's no question about it. They were democratically elected. But if you look at polls done in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories during times of war, Hamas's popularity skyrockets. And I think that there's a kind of similar situation with the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis are leading resistance against this brutal war that is killing thousands of civilians, and they're supported because of that. It's not necessarily that people are fans of their political movement, but what war does, it forces people into the arms of, potential political forces that they might have not previously been allied with. And I think, especially look at how extreme Saudi Arabia is, and when you look at what Saudi Arabia has been doing in the southern areas of Yemen that it controls, and perhaps we can talk about that, imposing these, extreme, strict Wahhabi systems of governance. It makes sense that people, even Sunnis who are opposed to, the political Islamism of the Houthi movement, still support the Houthis fighting this brutal war and resisting the horrific bombing of their own people.
Well, it's interesting, Ben, when you look at the initial statements when the Houthis came on the scene, because I didn't know what to make of it. I saw the Saudis and other people saying this is a proxy war for Iran. They're an Iranian front, la, la, la. But if you look at the State Department language, they actually went out of their way to tiptoe around and say, we have no objection to the Houthi movement. They even gave it like a sort of designation of an activist, like this is a separate reformist almost movement. We don't really want to have it, we're not really opposed to this. And there's a lot of evidence for people who have analyzed this that the Iranian connection is almost an ex post facto thing, meaning the Saudis use that as a pretext, and the Iranians, if anything, are backing them now just because they feel like they're being insulted by proxy. So the original estimate was this wasn't really an Iranian-linked movement, and it was even by the U.S. State Department tolerated, or at least given the gravitas of being a reform movement, not a terrorist group or a terrorist insurgency. And to your point about sort of the hypocrisy, I think there's an incredible amount of cynicism going on right now, because it's clear, at least to me, and maybe this is a little psychological analysis, that the Saudis are throwing a brutal, bloody temper tantrum on the Yemenis because they're not getting their way in Syria. And the U.S.'s position is basically, go ahead and slaughter these people if it makes you feel better. And we're not going to stand in your way. Because when you look at, there's no real strategic interest for, you really have to stretch it to believe that. So I think the cynicism of both, Saudi Arabia's impotent rage related to Syria and being taken out, misdirected at a kind of overblown problem. I think that's cynical, and I think it's very cynical for the U.S. to tolerate it.
There's a really strategic strait there, and
I was just about to say that it's an incredibly important region strategically.
So it's a really poor country, but they're in a really strategic location. And that might even become more strategic as China does their Silk Road project. There's a land route and there's a maritime route. And last I looked, I'm sorry that I'm not up to date on this, but they hadn't yet decided what the route into the Mediterranean was going to be, whether they were going to use the Suez Canal, which I guess, most likely, or whether they were going to. Anyway, it's almost certainly going to be even more important going forward. So, I think that has to have something to do with it. And I always wonder if there are resources there that we don't know about.
Well, I don't think there are significant natural resources in Yemen, especially compared to other Gulf countries. But you're absolutely, and this is a point I was going to make earlier. I kind of was ranting a bit and got off there, but this is an incredibly important region strategically. And from the very beginning, I think it's been clear that Western powers have been interested in policing the coast there. So right in the beginning, in April, right after the war was launched, the U.S. sent 2 large warships off of the coast, and the U.S. still has Navy ships off the coast. In fact, about 2 months ago, the U.S. had a Navy vessel off the coast that was allegedly, although it's not confirmed, allegedly was attacked by the Houthis, or rather, it was targeted by missiles from some militant group inside Houthi-controlled territory. The U.S. government immediately blamed the Houthis, and in response, the U.S. threw missiles into Houthi-controlled territory. And that was the first time that the U.S. military itself was directly bombing Houthis inside Yemen, and not through the side of the coalition. But I think the U.S. is very committed to policing the waters there, it's in a very important trade route. And as you mentioned, with the rise of Chinese influence and with the rise of Iranian influence, I think the U.S. and the U.K., which recently sent a very large warship to off of the coast of Yemen as well. I think both of them are absolutely interested in making sure that they control what goes through that area. And I'll add one more point here. The U.S. and the U.K. are using as an excuse to justify their presence there. Why does the U.S. Navy have the right to police the coast of Yemen? The argument they're making is, well, not only is the Saudi-led coalition imposing a blockade that they're participating in, but also they're supposedly trying to stop Iran from sending weapons to the Houthis. So if you look at U.S. government statements, they say, yes, we are intercepting ships and such to make sure that they're not trying to smuggle weapons into Yemen to fuel the war, etc. So, of course, that's a pretty absurd argument when you consider that the U.S. has sent more than $100 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which are being used in Yemen. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented several instances in which U.S.-made and U.K.-made cluster munitions are found in the rubble of bombed civilian targets inside Yemen. And also cluster munitions made in Brazil, but especially those made in the U.S. and the U.K. So, it's a very cynical argument when you consider the U.S. role in this conflict. But I have no doubt that at the end of the day, the U.S., which has been, again, waging a drone war in Yemen and clearly sees it as an important region strategically, is interested in policing the trade route there. And then, of course, there's also the issue of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which we can maybe get into, because I know you wanted to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I have one on that, and then we'll go back to you, Joanne. What's interesting about what I've read so far, and you're clearly more up on this than I am, but we're seeing this constant pattern of the war on terror working at cross purposes. So on the one hand, there was a statement, I just saw the Pentagon release a statement in December, I think it was the 22nd, that they had launched these drone strikes that killed 20-some odd AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula militants, right? So they've been waging, and one of the justifications, by the way, in the Pentagon press release was 2009 attempted Christmas bombing, et cetera, et cetera. But then they're empowering Saudi Arabia, which is controlling the region and imposing the ideology of Al-Qaeda, which is Wahhabism, which is this Salafism, meaning there's going to be another generation of people sympathetic, at least just on terms of the actual consequences of policy. You're letting them impose this very, very strict interpretation of the Quran. We know it leads to this kind of radicalization. That's what's led to it elsewhere. And so at the same time that you're engaging in drone strikes, to tackle AQAP, you're empowering the people who are going to inspire, to quote the magazine of Al-Qaeda, inspire the next generation of AQAP fighters, right? Isn't that yet again cross purposes?
Oh, I mean, when it comes to the role of Al-Qaeda in the war in Yemen, it's just hard to overstate the incredible hypocrisy of the U.S. and also the extreme degree to which this war has undermined what the U.S. has claimed that it had wanted to do in Yemen for years. Since after 9/11, the U.S. has carried out a drone war in Yemen and even killed U.S. citizens, including the extremist cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was, the U.S. said he was probably a propagandist for Al-Qaeda. I mean, he pretty much was. He had no trial and he was never charged. His son was also killed, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki. So, these are U.S. citizens who were killed in Yemen in drone strikes by their own government without any charge or trial. It's pretty Orwellian. But, there have been many other drone strikes. The U.S. has hit weddings, it has hit funerals, etc. And then the war breaks out in March, in which the U.S. backs a Saudi-led coalition, ostensibly to fight the Houthis and Al-Qaeda. But the irony is, in many ways, there has been a kind of strategic, coalition of convenience between Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula and the Saudi-led coalition. In fact, a Saudi journalist and dissident, Saf al-Ahmad, who she has also reported on, the 2011 protests in Saudi Arabia, which got very little coverage. The protests in Syria and Libya did, but not the protests in a close U.S. ally like Saudi Arabia. She's a filmmaker and did a report for the BBC in which she captured footage inside Yemen of Emirati troops who were part of the Saudi-led U.S.-backed coalition fighting alongside Al-Qaeda against Houthi rebels. And there have been other reports. That's one that has been confirmed and reported by the BBC. I have seen other reports which have not been confirmed, but it's potentially possible that the Saudi-led coalition has in other instances allied out of convenience with these extremist groups. And Reuters did a very good piece a few months ago looking at how, if any group has profited and benefited from the war in Yemen, it has certainly been Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which people also should understand is the most extreme branch of Al-Qaeda. In fact, before ISIS even existed, if you look at AQAP's flag, their flag, it looks like ISIS's flag. I mean, ideologically, they're not very different from ISIS. They're a very extreme group, and they've been beaten back a little bit. But at one point, they were controlling hundreds of miles on the southern coast of Yemen. So the U.S. spent years ostensibly fighting Al-Qaeda through its drone war, and then it's been fueling this horrific conflict, providing billions of weapons to Saudi Arabia and support. And the U.S. even had military officials inside the command room with Saudi bombers who were attacking targets. The UK also had officials inside the command room. And then this conflict has only strengthened Al-Qaeda, which the U.S. claimed that it was fighting for years in the first place. So and then when you throw in ISIS, I mean, ISIS did not exist in Yemen before this war began. And of course, ISIS did not exist in Syria before, the war in Syria began. ISIS didn't even exist. I mean, ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was strengthened by the U.S. war in Iraq. So, I mean, you can go back to U.S. military intervention and see how it keeps creating these horrific Frankenstein's monsters that then the U.S. has to uses to further justify more military intervention. It's a never-ending, perpetual circle. And in the case of ISIS, this is very troubling. ISIS has carried out numerous sectarian attacks inside Yemen. I mentioned that Yemen has a very significant Shia minority. So ISIS has been attacking the Shia population. They've also been attacking, ironically, soldiers from the Saudi-led coalition. There have been a few instances in the past several weeks in which Saudi-led coalition forces, like their soldiers on the ground in the south, have been in line to get their paychecks. And then there's a suicide bombing. And on two separate instances, ISIS killed about 50 soldiers. So, I mean, the country is absolutely out of control at this point. I mean, Yemen already had a lot of issues with instability before this war began in March of last year, of 2015. But, I mean, this is only further exacerbating extremism in the country. And then, of course, when you look at the material conditions that give rise to these extremist groups, they thrive off of people who have been completely disenfranchised, people who have no participation in any kind of political system. People who, for people who have no food, have, etc., no medicine, etc. Their family has been killed by this tribe, this militia, etc. And they join Al Qaeda, they join ISIS, etc. They are offered a paycheck. I mean, these extremist groups are well funded, probably by investors
by the Saudis. By the Saudis. I mean, that's part of this. I mean, the issue is that dynamic you just identified of. There's these forces. There's the Saudi forces aligned with Al Qaeda there. That is exactly what happened. There was a WikiLeaks email where it's one of the few ones Hillary Clinton actually wrote to John Podesta, where she says, I'm going to the region and I'm going to talk to Qatar and Saudi Arabia about funding ISIS. This is in the WikiLeaks email. So Hillary Clinton's aware of this, but it looks really, the more you look at it, when you talk about proxy wars and proxy armies, that the Al Qaeda is this proxy force for Saudi interests. That's exactly the role they're playing in Syria. That's exactly the role they're playing in Yemen. I mean, maybe not directly, maybe not on purpose, but that seems to be the net effect is all this money's coming in. Who's paying these stipends, right? Where's the money coming in to pay for these stipends? So there's some linkage there. I don't make it one for one, but there's some linkage. Can we say that at least?
The way Al Qaeda is, and also this is when its origins in the war in Afghanistan. Al Qaeda grew out of the so-called Arab Mujahideen, which were forces organized by Osama bin Laden, who's of course Saudi and comes from a filthy rich family from the bin Laden construction group. And he used his enormous wealth to fund an international brigade of far-right fascist Islamist forces inside Afghanistan to fight the evil, atheist, God-hating Soviets. And then, of course, when the war in Afghanistan ended, you have this international brigade of extremists who continue under the name Al Qaeda, right? So when you look at its origins, it's always been an international force, and I don't think it's entirely accurate to say. Of course, Al Qaeda has shifted over the years, but I don't think it's accurate to say that it is an extension of Saudi power. But I think there's no question that in certain conflicts, Saudi Arabia is objectively on the side of Al Qaeda. So in the case of Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, and even the CIA, have been on the side of Jabhat al-Nusra, the Syrian Al Qaeda affiliate, which rebranded recently as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. It's still basically Al Qaeda. There's no question. Even mainstream media reports and major news outlets have acknowledged. Even the New York Times recently acknowledged that the CIA was on the side of Al Qaeda in Syria. The Washington Post had a very interesting article recently where they said the CIA was shielding Al Qaeda in Syria. And in the war in Yemen, you see that as well. But it's also important to realize that Al Qaeda actually does not like the Saudi regime. Al Qaeda recognizes that the Saudi royal family is incredibly hypocritical and refers to them in Arabic as hypocrites, there's a history of that in Islamic theology of, many extremists refer to Shia as hypocrites, etc. So there's no question that there are elements within the Saudi state that are openly supporting Al Qaeda and other extremist groups and ISIS. You mentioned that email. The interesting thing about the email is I think it was probably written by Sidney Blumenthal, who's Hillary Clinton's aide, and because I looked carefully at the language. Also, it uses some unusual spelling that some of Sidney Blumenthal's other intelligence memos used, like they spelled Assad Assed and things like that. So it was probably written by Sidney Blumenthal, and that report that Hillary Clinton sent to John Podesta, which could have potentially been classified, we don't know, but that report is citing U.S. and Western intelligence. This is pretty much incontrovertible. U.S. intelligence agencies knew for years, they knew that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two of their most important allies in the region, were supporting ISIS, this genocidal extremist fascist group that now the U.S. is using to justify bombing Iraq and Syria again. So, certainly there's no question that there are what people refer to as angel investors inside the Gulf, not just in Saudi, also inside Qatar, who are supporting these extremist groups. And the Saudi regime has kind of played a double game, kind of like Turkey, where sometimes Saudi Arabia will crack down on support for foreign extremist groups, and sometimes they'll just allow it to happen. They know what's going on, but there are thousands of Saudis fighting in Syria with extremist groups. There are thousands of Saudis who are also part of ISIS. And, I think Saudi Arabia is like Turkey. I think they're getting some backlash from this policy. they thought that they can contain these forces, these extremist forces, and they can't. At the end of the day, yeah, you can provide some weapons and support to these what they are fascist groups. I mean, they're not related to Islam as a religion. They are fascist. I mean, like, there are Christian fascist groups, like, Maronite extremists. They're not Christian, they're fascist. I mean, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are fascist forces, and these governments think that they can support these fascist paramilitaries for a little bit, but eventually they're going to get burned. And I think that's what's happening right now with Turkey in particular. So just to reiterate, yeah, there's no question. If you look at in 2009, Hillary Clinton signed off on a U.S. State Department memo, which is classified, which was released by WikiLeaks, which acknowledged that Saudi Arabia is the largest support for Sunni extremist groups in the world. This is the U.S. government, which has all this intelligence and is very aware of what's going on, but of course continues to ally with Saudi Arabia, which of course has the second largest oil reserves in the world, and even more important than that, basically controls OPEC. So if Saudi Arabia wants to change the prices of oil in the global market, Saudi Arabia can overproduce oil, which it's been doing recently, which has dropped the prices of oil in the international economy and really hindered and really damaged the economies of Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, of course, major U.S. enemies. So Saudi Arabia is a very important ally of the U.S. strategically, and the U.S. is willing to overlook the fact that even its own intelligence analysis acknowledges that this is the largest support, weapons, and supplies for all these extremist groups that the U.S. is using the war on terror to justify attacking.
Yeah, and also, of course, they one of the theories was they overproduced to hurt U.S. suppliers because they didn't want to get cut out of the U.S. market because we're having some sort of petro boom here too.
Along the lines of the Saudi coalition, so I saw a BBC report from yesterday or something, and they were saying that the Yemeni National Army is about 40 miles outside of Sana'a, and looking to take the capital. And they didn't show too many of the soldiers. They just show like a commander and all that. And I realized that I wasn't really sure who the Yemen National Army is, because Salah, I think, has a lot of the former Yemen army on his side. And, I had seen the reports about soldiers and Al-Qaeda fighting side by side. I've seen things about, I'm not even sure who the Saudi coalition is at this point, because I thought the Emiratis pulled back. I thought I saw a convoy of troops and equipment heading back to the United Arab Emirates. I know that they really, really wanted Egypt to bring ground troops in, and I think Egypt refused. And ground troops are always the holy grail in Middle East wars, it seems. The Gulf countries, the United States, and the other coalition, I mean, you can get air support, but it's really hard to get people to fight on the ground. And so, who was that Yemeni National Army on the march to Sana'a, 40 miles outside the capital, that the BBC was talking about?
Salah was leader until 2011, and there were massive protests, during the Arab Spring uprisings throughout the region, and Salah was forced to step down. But I mean, this is he was certainly a dictatorial leader who ruled the country for many years without any kind of democratic consent. But he actually does have a lot of support inside Yemen, and actually the war has only increased his support. And the irony is, he used to be staunchly opposed to the Houthis. In fact, he violently repressed the Houthis when he was in power. But again, this is like what happens in times of war. You have this alliance of conveniences. So there are elements of the military that are loyal to Salah, who have allied with the Houthis, and there are these groups called Popular Resistance Committee, which are now running the Yemeni government, at least the capital Sana'a. But in the south of the country, which is also interesting historically, because until 1990, Yemen was actually divided between north and south, and actually South Yemen it's the only Marxist country that has ever existed in the Middle East. And but in South Yemen, there are now cities that are under the control of the Saudi-led coalition, and what's called the internationally recognized government, but it's just Hadi, the Saudi puppet who fled to Saudi Arabia when the war began in March. And they also have a military, which they refer to as the Yemeni National Army, which I mentioned earlier, which has been attacked by ISIS, and they are working on retaking territory from the Houthis. I've seen reports that claim that they are going to try to retake Sana'a. I mean, I don't doubt that they're going to try to retake it. Who knows if they'll be successful? It's going to be a very hard fight, and they're certainly not popular. I mean, it's hard to judge what popular approval is of these different militant groups and forces inside Yemen, just because there haven't been many polls taken. It's been difficult to do in times of brutal war like this. But I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, that as you go north, there's more support for the Houthis. And I also think that, the Yemeni army that is backed by Saudi Arabia has interest in, exaggerating its influence, exaggerating its power. And, they may say, okay, we're 40 miles from Sana'a, but that's much easier said than accomplished. I mean, retaking one of the largest cities and the capital is going to be a very difficult battle.
Literally
Absolutely.
uphill battle too.
Literally uphill. Also, at the same time, there have been recent discussions of fire, and there was actually a UN agreement that was floated out there. It would have called for Hadi to step down, but that deal fell through. I think there probably is. I think at this point, the war in Syria will not have a political solution. I think the Syrian government is going to retake Idlib, and then basically all that's left, aside from some small groups, are Raqqa. And the battle in Raqqa is already going on against ISIS. I think the war in Yemen actually may end with a political solution. If not, I mean, I have no idea when this war could end. I mean, it could go on for a long time. But I do think that the Yemeni army is probably exaggerating its influence there.
Speaking of political solution, so I heard an interview with a Yemeni journalist, and he was upset because he said that John Kerry sort of laid out what they wanted the Houthis and the different factions to do he feels that they met their terms and they formed a new government. It was a unity government, and everyone had an input, and then it was rejected. So how does that peace I know there have been several different peace processes that went along. There were some ceasefires, and they always seem to fall through. Do you have an opinion on what would be the best way to get to that political solution? It seems to me that the Saudis always demand that the Houthis lay down their arms and leave, and it always seems pretty one-sided when the terms sort of get laid out on the table. And it seems like if the Saudis don't get everything they want, there can be no solution. Is that a skewed view, or is that an accurate view? Or
it's really hard to say. It's a very good question. It's hard to say. I will say there actually was a very successful ceasefire. I thought the war was going to end in early 2015, or 2016. I'm sorry, early 2016. So about a year into the conflict, there was a ceasefire that was reached, and for about 3 months, there were very few attacks. There certainly was not peace, but there was relative peace for about 3 months. I thought that was probably going to be the end of the war, but then the Saudi-led coalition, backed by the U.S., continued to bomb targets, and violence picked up. I think, honestly, the only way that in the short term this conflict can come to an end is there's going to be a political agreement in which the popular resistance committees, consisting of the Houthis and the Salah loyal forces, are given some representation in the government. I think it's pretty clear at this point that they have enough popularity that people are going to fight in place in their government. The Hadi government is not going to be able to be restored without guaranteeing some kind of voice for them. And Saudi Arabia is not going to be able to impose its own puppet government on the country, especially, Yemen has, I've spoken to many Yemenis in the past 2 years about the conflict and interviewed many, and I have not met any who like Saudi Arabia. And if anything, this conflict has only, further moved Yemenis away from Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia has a history of subjugating Yemen, and now there's incredible antipathy toward the country. So whether that's going to happen is, of course, hard to tell. Saudi Arabia has invested a lot in this conflict. To answer your other question a second ago, the coalition technically consists of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Morocco, etc. So mostly Sunni monarchies. That said, most of those countries have not played a very big role in the war. By far, Saudi Arabia has been the most important actor, and then the UAE has been the second most important actor. But like you said, the UAE was participating in, pretty intensely in the war. They even had ground troops inside Yemen, but the UAE has actually removed a lot of its support. The UAE is still supporting the coalition, but it is not participating as actively as it had in the past. And actually, there was an interesting report in the New York Times about how the UAE and the Saudi coalition were even hiring Colombian mercenaries that were fighting inside Yemen. So this is truly, an international coalition that is waging war against Yemen. And unless there's some kind of pressure, I think at the end of the day from the U.S., like there was in the war in Gaza in 2014, in which for 50 days Israel brutally bombed one of the most densely populated regions of the world, killing more than 2,251 people. Immediately when Obama said that he's withdrawing support for the Israeli war, overnight, literally overnight, the Israeli government announced that it was going to end its bombing campaign. I think that if the U.S. government is committed to pushing for a political solution inside Yemen, what the government will say is, we need to make sure that the Houthis and the Salah-aligned forces have a say in the government, and we're going to withdraw support for the coalition until some kind of ceasefire is met. And I think if and when that happens, the war will end pretty rapidly.
All right, Ben. On that note, thank you so much for your time. We thank you both and really appreciate it.
Thanks so much,
My
Ben.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
Great to have you.
Okay, that's our show. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Benjamin Norton for giving us an interview. You can follow him at Twitter, @Benjamin Norton, and see his work at Alternet GrayZone Project, where he'll be talking more about Yemen. And please support the show at patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire. $5 a month helps us put on the show. Question, comments, or just to yell at me, dan@shadowproof.com, and see more of mine and Joanne's work at Shadowproof. Thanks a lot. See you next time.